Hello, biblical history students. I wanted to make a video to kick off book number 2 in the semester. This is my version, the New Testament History by Ben Witherington. We have now gotten through all the Old Testament stuff, and now for the rest of the semester, we're going to look at kind of the New Testament history and what we know. It's a lot easier, primarily because it's only 100 years. Given that it coincides with the Roman Empire and Caesar Augustus and all those guys that we already have a lot of information on, so it's easier to plug in the events of the New Testament into that wider, that larger background. So I think you're going to find this is the part of the course that, well, for all practical purposes, is pretty easy. If you can keep dates straight and people straight and just kind of place them in their historical timeline, you're going to do pretty well. There's not nearly as much of fogginess or whatnot with New Testament history. So this week, you're starting off, you're reading the first 2 chapters, really the prologue, what he calls the prolegomenon, and the first 2 chapters. So it's a little long, this assignment. But what I'm going to do is, the assignment, I'm going to, instead of having you hand in every chapter 1 back at a time, it's going to be every 2 chapters, so you have a little bit more time to do it. I think it's easier that way. Anyway, I wanted to say a few words about New Testament history and what you're going to be reading. The prologue in the book is, he really kind of talks about history, how do you do the historical stuff, what the Gospels are. So some of it is little overlap of the background stuff, the preliminary stuff from the Old Testament book. How do you do history? How do you understand the text? In this case, what are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as Gospels? He's going to talk about the genre of that, and that's going to be an important thing to realize, because when it comes to the New Testament, specifically the Gospels, what are they? What's their genre? I think most people, outside of what they call the Jesus mythicist movement, most people acknowledge that these are real historical people, events. They might quibble with whether or not Jesus really walked on water or not, but 99% of people, in fact, probably 99.9% of scholars will acknowledge there was a historical Jesus. He was considered to be a Jewish Messiah. He was crucified under Pilate. Those basic historical facts, hardly anybody disputes. So we're not going to go down the Jesus mythicist route. But in any case, in the prologue, he talks about what the biographies are. They're called ancient historical biographies. That means they're historical. They're about real history. They're about biography about Jesus and what he did. But at the same time, Luke acts as more of a historical monograph. They're similar. But Witherington's going to talk about what the defining characteristics of those genres are and how you, therefore, are to read, in this case, the Gospels. Long story short, they are about history, but they're still being fashioned into a narrative. When you get to the book of Acts and you read of Peter's sermon at Pentecost, it wasn't like Luke was there taking dictation. The speech characterizes what Peter's preaching was, but it's not a verbatim manuscript. And you have to keep that in mind, and that should be not surprising, and that should be okay. In any case, he's going to talk about that stuff in the prologue, about how you read the Gospels and what they are. Chapter 1 is really going to be New Testament background of what scholars call the intertestamental period, taken from the time of Alexander the Great up to the coming of Rome into Judea. And so that's just going to be a lot of historical background. You got to know who Alexander the Great is. You're going to learn quite a lot about what is called the Maccabean Revolt. Pay attention to that, because the Maccabean Revolt and what caused it, a Seleucid ruler named Antiochus Epiphanes, that's a really important thing to realize, because that has a big impact on how we interpret a lot of the stuff going on in the Gospels. And so that's an important thing to realize. It's the Antiochus Epiphanes basically tried to wipe Judaism out. And the Jews revolted, the Maccabean Revolt, that's how we get Hanukkah. And after that, the Maccabees, they weren't messianic. They said they weren't messianic, but they were going to make it their own kingdom until the Messiah came. And so after the Maccabean Revolt, the Maccabees established the Hasmonean dynasty, which lasted for about 100 years. And as you're going to find out, it was pretty bloody and chaotic and corrupt, which is kind of a bummer. But that does set the stage for when we do get to the New Testament and what the Jews were expecting in the first century. So that's an important background material. Obviously, talking about all that, he's going to be talking about the influence of Hellenism, Greek culture on the Jews of the first century. That cannot be overlooked. We often think, Jews in the first century, they were all just kind of like all the Jews we see in the Jesus movies. There's a lot of Greek culture, multiculturalism going around, and you had kind of traditional Jews who wanted to keep to the Torah and keep the temple pure, but you had a lot of Jews who really liked Greek lifestyle. And, there's a tug of war in those areas as well. So you have to realize that. Get a bigger picture of how all that historical background of the first century fits together. And then when you read the Gospels in this case, and later Paul and whatnot, but right now it's just going to be the Gospels, you're going to see a lot more stuff going on, which we'll unpack as we go through this book. Chapter 2, he specifically talks about the rise of Herod, the Herodians, how he came to power. He isn't even fully Jewish. He was part Jewish, part Idumean. He basically kissed up to the Caesars, and they gave him some stuff. So he was the king of the Jews, but no Jew really liked him. And in that context of Herod the Great and the time of Caesar Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, that's when the birth of Jesus happens. And so Witherington is going to talk about the birth narratives, which is in Matthew 1 and 2 and Luke 1 and 2, and how that fits in against the backdrop of Rome at the time and Herod at the time of what we know. And, talk about the historical questions about how much of it's true, what are some historical details that are a little problematic. Because there are a few that you do have to wrestle with. I'll mention one of the more popular, not popular ones, but one of the more well-known ones is if you read Matthew's infancy narrative, it clearly places Matthew's the birth of Jesus before the death of Herod. Jesus is born. You're told that Herod wants to kill the boys 2 years and younger in Bethlehem, which again, Bethlehem was like a small town of a couple hundred people. So in reality, if we're to believe this happened, it wasn't like Herod sent a legion of soldiers just to start slaughtering kids. He probably sent a couple of guys from Jerusalem 7 miles down the road to just kill a couple kids in the dead of night. What wouldn't have been a big slaughter that people have known about. But anyway, Matthew places the birth of Jesus and all that stuff happening within the last few years of Herod the Great. And we are told that when Herod the Great dies, that's when Jesus, Joseph, and Mary come back from Egypt because they had fled, and they come back and they eventually settle in Nazareth. So we know from other records that Herod the Great died, according to our calendar, in 4 BC. So that would mean that the birth of Jesus happened before then. And since Herod tried to kill the boys 2 years and younger, give that 2 years, a lot of scholars think that Jesus was born, even though it sounds weird, according to our calendar, in 6 BC, 6 years before Christ, before the Common Era, what have you. So that's kind of a calendar problem. Whoever made the calendar, they got it wrong. But the point is, according to Matthew, Jesus was born roughly 6 BC in the reign of Herod. The problem is when you get to Luke, and Luke clearly says that Jesus was born during the time of the Caesar Augustus's census. And the first empire-wide census, and this is just a fact, the first empire-wide census under the governor of Quirinius, who was the governor of Syria at the time, that happened in, according to our calendar, 6 AD or 6 CE. That's a 12-year difference between what Matthew says Jesus was born and when Luke says Jesus was born. So a lot of scholars, how do you make sense of that? On top of that, which makes it even more problematic, which I was shocked to see a lot of scholars don't even take this into consideration, is that even though Luke places the birth of Jesus during the time of the census, 6 AD, in the previous chapter of Luke chapter 1, when he talks about Gabriel appearing to Zechariah and then later to Mary, he clearly says that Gabriel appeared to Zechariah in the days of Herod, which would have placed it before 4 BC. So Luke is doing something kind of weird there that has to be wrestled with. And that's going to be one of your questions, and I'll, explain that when I grade your homework. But how do you make sense of that? Some people think, Luke is just a bad historian and he made a mistake. But no scholar thinks that Luke was a bad historian. In fact, he was the one more committed to plotting out the history. So he's probably doing something slightly different. And that gets to the heart of, I don't want to give it away, but how you read the Gospels. They are history, but the writers have a certain amount of literary license to shape things to fit their story. And so that's something we'll have to think about. The example I give, I don't know if I gave it with the Old Testament stuff, but it's kind of like a movie. The movie Hacksaw Ridge, the Mel Gibson World War II movie a couple years ago. That's about a historical event and a historical person. And so everybody who watches Hacksaw Ridge realizes that's about history. But at the same time, the way Gibson crafts the story to fit into a 2-hour, limit, he changes some of those minor details and some of the events to kind of fit in with the narrative, draw it all together, which you could say fictionalizes it, I guess, if you will. But it's not. We don't have a problem with that. For example, in the movie, the reason why Private Doss becomes a conscientious objector is in the movie, when he was younger, his mother and father got into a fight, and his father pulled out a gun and was threatening to kill his mother. And so therefore, in the movie, that's why he's a conscientious objector. In real life, there was a fight, but it was between his father and his uncle. But Mel Gibson obviously said, that's another character I don't want to bring into the narrative, so I'm just going to make it between him and his mother, and we're going to go on from there. So technically that detail is wrong, but it fits in with the narrative, and we don't think much about it. We still consider it a historically reliable movie. Same kind of thing sometimes happens in the Gospels. The Gospel writers might change a few things here and there, more minor details that they don't feel is that important. But we, in our 21st century, we have to get everything perfectly lined up historically, or we don't trust it. We have a problem with it, but they didn't. With all that said, when you get to that, try to wrestle with it. Read the infancy narrative, see what you can do. He also talks about the question of the virginal conception. We could call it the virginal birth, the virgin birth. Technically, it's a virginal conception, but how historical is that? What is Matthew doing when he quotes Isaiah 7:14? That's another historical question that you have to deal with. So we'll look at that. And then obviously Herod's slaughter of the babies. Is that historical? How do we make sense of that? And basically how that fits in with all that stuff. So hopefully, as you do this first assignment for the New Testament book, you'll be thinking about those issues. So long story short, the prologue is how you read the Gospels. What are they? How do you assess them from a historical standpoint? Chapter 1 is going to be that intertestamental background stuff that you want to get straight. And then chapter 2 is going to specifically deal with the birth narratives in Matthew and Luke. That's basically Matthew 1 and 2 and Luke 1 and 2, and how they fit in with the Greco-Roman world and Herod. So a lot of stuff. So do what you can, do the best you can, and I'll answer some questions when I grade your homework, and maybe my next video I might say a few more things on that as kind of go from there. All right, enjoy that. Bye.